18 players. Today we're going to be discussing the Carolina Panthers getting the first pick in the draft, getting the quarterback that they wanted, and hopefully they can build around. And, you know, Bob, as I think about this team, this has been a team that's been chasing shiny objects, particularly at the quarterback situation, and paying a whole lot of resources for it. And as a result, with the exception of maybe their defensive secondary, I'm not seeing a whole lot of units in this team that are like, yeah, I really want to go home with that. You know, their offensive line has two really good parts. The receiving, their skill position players, I don't think has anyone you would draft in the first 5 rounds of any fantasy league, regardless of format. So it's not exactly the greatest landing pad. And when you're in a division that basically is saying, hey, let's just run the ball, and hope our defense hasn't blown the game by the time the clock is over, Frank Reich is a hell of a good coach for that. Frank Reich will get more out of Miles Sanders than Philadelphia did for sure, and I agree with that. But I look at the passing options. Their big addition is Hurst, the tight end from Cincinnati, who didn't really blow up the world up there.
I would disagree with you that that's not the biggest option, but go ahead, continue.
Oh, my point is, unless you're going with chart, which I'm all disclosure, I was never a chart guy. Just wasn't. Sorry. So that's how I look at this team, Bob. I wish that they had more of a pass rush on defense because I like their secondary. But the problem with the NFL is teams that try to go all in on coverage tend to get worn down and let up big plays. Unless you have a significant pass rush. I like their run defense, but which will be good for the way their division's built. But I don't see a way when these guys come push the shove, if the Saints start marching, how these guys are going to be able to compete, let alone with the two legitimate teams in the AFC South that they have to play. And I just think that there's a lot of challenges that Carolina has. And I think their biggest challenge for this season in particular is make sure that you don't ruin another quarterback. I think that has to be the number one goal and objective of this team.
Yeah, that's definitely the number one objective anytime you get a young quarterback. I mean, let's be honest here.
I think it's more so with them because they have a track record of imploding for the last 6 years.
Yeah, when you're thinking about the Carolina Panthers, I wouldn't say necessarily the last 6 years, but there was a time with the Carolina Panthers when they were going through the Brady Quinn experience and trying to figure out what their future is as a franchise. I mean, on paper, there doesn't seem to be a lot to like about the Carolina Panthers. There's nothing that really makes me want to buy a seat at their game. And if you take a look, and that's particularly telling when you take a look and people go on ESPN's schedule and there's always like, you know, the ticket prices on StubHub and all that stuff. I mean, none of these games at home are hovering anywhere above like $60. You can get a seat for $60 at these games. And we're talking about games against Minnesota. We're talking about games against New Orleans. We're talking about division foes. You know, the biggest one is Dallas at like $100. And so like the fan base in Carolina, and we've talked to, you know, Dave, our Carolina fan, earlier in the year, and he basically laid it out on the line and said, you know, this is the season where you fire Matt Rule and you get the number one pick and you go and get Bryce Young. And he called it. It happened.
Success.
It's a thing. And you say, okay, well, did they do enough for their fan base? And what I'm seeing from their roster construction, at least on offense, is that they're actually giving their team a fighting chance in games, whereas last year that wasn't so much of an option. Yes, DJ Shark and Adam Thielen, they're not the players that they once were, but they're definitely better than the options that existed last year outside of DJ Moore. And when you look at the running game and you see, okay, we got rid of Donta Foreman and Christian McCaffrey last year, and we're picking up Miles Sanders. Well, Miles Sanders is a really good running back. Pair him with Chuba Hubbard. If health wasn't an issue for both Miles Sanders and Chuba Hubbard, that would be a pretty reliable run game. And we haven't really seen Miles Sanders shine in Philadelphia. And having Deuce Staley, a player from Philadelphia who coached up the Lions so well last year in terms of the running game, all signs point to this team is going to have a healthier offense and a better future on offense. This all hinges, though, on if Bryce Young is going to click as a quarterback.
Mm-hmm.
They've given him old players, but these are players that are reliable players. And I think when you take it from that perspective, they're not going to be an explosive team. This team is not going to be explosive in terms of any offensive capabilities. But when we look at Chark and what he offers over the top, when we look at Thielen and what he offers underneath, this team feels more balanced depending on how Bryce Young takes on the game.
Yeah.
And when you look at it and you're a young quarterback, I want to be surrounded with veterans, and I don't really want to be surrounded with young guys. And I think what Frank Reich did here in his moves in the offseason is to say, we knew we were coming after Bryce Young. We knew what we were going to do. We don't need young guys because we need people that are going to teach this young man what to do in the game of football. And I think it's setting the Carolina Panthers up for future success, maybe not immediate success this year. Because when you look at their schedule and you see the teams that they play.
Yeah, so they have the AFC South. So
Right.
Houston's obviously a winnable game. And then you have the crossover game is Miami. So that's their bonus game. Their other bonus game is going to be the Rams. And then it's going to be messed up the primary division they're playing. I'm sorry about that. But they're playing the Packers. So they're playing the North.
Yeah.
So I see these guys completely being able to be a 6-win team when it's all said and done.
So where I was going with that too, though, Joe, is that you talked about their defensive secondary being exceptional. And we've talked about this when we reviewed the Carolina Panthers, that was oftentimes both their best and a weak link on that side of the ball because they're getting exhausted because there's no pass rush. Their run-stopping defense was good, but it caused a lot of teams to then force the ball down the field, which then exhausted those players in coverage a lot more, and there was nothing coming back. When you look at the teams that they have, and you don't include their divisional opponents outside of the Saints, who have Carr, who's incredible at getting the ball downfield, you're looking at Ritter, you're looking at potentially Kyle Trask, but then outside of the division, you've got a schedule that is filled with passers that can get the ball downfield, and that's their strength.
Well, of the AFC South, the only one that really does is Jacksonville. I mean, we'll see what the Colts become, but Houston can't put the ball downfield. Tennessee doesn't.
Seattle, Minnesota.
Detroit, those guys do. Yeah. The whole NFC North will push the ball. But I'm saying that there's some teams that this matches up well for. And when I look at Carolina and say their best chance of victory this year is knowing the fact that this team, especially on offense, looks very similar to the Colts rosters, at least recent Colts rosters, with the exception that they have a young quarterback. Colts rosters never really have dynamic receivers, especially under Frank Reich. They had guys who can get open and they can make catches and play action.
So speaking of the Colts, and this is really important to point out in Carolina's schedule, and something that we did gloss over a little bit when we talked about Indianapolis and when we talked about Houston, is that looking at their schedule, and you say how many of the teams that they've played, or how many teams that they're playing this year, have a quarterback that has started more than 4 games. They play Atlanta twice. They play Tampa Bay twice. They play Houston, who has C.J. Stroud. They play Indy, who has Anthony Richardson. They play Chicago, who has Justin Fields, who we're not sold on as a quarterback yet. Then they have Tennessee with Will Levis. Then they have Green Bay with Jordan Love later in the season in week 16. And then they play 18 against Tampa. I see, if everything shakes down correctly for the Carolina Panthers and Bryce Young develops over the course of the year, assuming that all of these players develop in step with Bryce Young, the Anthony Richardsons, the CJ Strouds, I see this team as getting potentially 8 wins. And in this conference, in this division specifically, 8 wins, you're fighting for a playoff spot. I don't think that any specific team is going to run away with this division because they do tend to fight each other pretty well. But I don't think 8 wins is out of the realm of possibility for this team. And I'm fairly certain that if you were to look up FanDuel right now and see their over and unders, it's probably sitting around 6.5, 7.5, somewhere in there because of their schedule. Now, that will probably change as we know a little bit more about these young quarterbacks as the season goes on. And if for some reason Bryce Young doesn't develop or does get hurt, they went out and they got Andy Dalton, who we don't love entirely, but, you know, as a game manager, it could be okay. But like I said earlier, the main issue with this team will be lack of explosion. The players and personnel that they have, there's going to be limited explosion play. So if they do get down late in a game, if they do suffer some kind of setback early in the game, it's going to be a struggle for them to claw their way back. They're going to have to take the lead early, and they're going to have to keep the lead. That's the way I see them winning 8 games. If they can't hold on to leads and they can't make leads, then this is probably going to be a 5-win team with another top 10 pick.
That's absolutely true. And the challenge that's going to be put upon this passing game is because they don't have explosiveness to push over the top. You're going to have contested throws that are deep accuracy throws all over the field, which is why they picked the right quarterback. Stroud could not make the throws that are going to be demanded by a Frank Wright offense, period. And the bottom line is I think that as they settle into this, it's going to happen. You know, I think that calling the 8+ win year is probably a little bit early because as you just said, Bob, it's a very specific game script they need. They need to have a lead early so teams are forced to throw on them. What they don't have that this team is missing and needs to step up and develop is the pass rushing part of their game. If they can get an above average pass rush consistently, then they can really take advantage of all those inexperienced quarterbacks you just brought up. Because it's a much different game whenever I'm up by 3, so therefore I don't need to push the ball downfield. We can take the punt and move on. So therefore, you know what, Ritter, don't worry about it. But whenever it comes down to and saying, hey, we're losing by 10. It's the 4th quarter. Now we got to throw into this Carolina secondary. There's a certain element that it doesn't matter when you have the pressure of the game clock on you, it can be a very strong thing to throw interceptions. So I like the back end of their secondary line. As I said at the beginning, to me, the entire season doesn't come down to the quarterback. If they're going to win this year, it's Miles Sanders. Does Miles Sanders put up 1,500 plus yards, 15 touchdowns? If he does, this is a playoff team. If he doesn't come close to that, they're not even close to the playoffs. So to me, that is the most through line of this team is the Miles Sanders production.
Now, I want to put this into perspective for you based upon what we saw from them last year, is that they accumulated 7 wins, 6 of which happened without Christian McCaffrey, and 6 of them happening with PJ Walker as your quarterback, Baker Mayfield as your quarterback, and Sam Darnold as your quarterback. If all of the data and all of the analysis that people have put into Bryce Young is correct, with a schedule that they have this year, which seems to be weaker than the schedule that they had last year.
Oh, it is.
You could make an argument for this team potentially accumulating more than 8 wins if Bryce Young is the quarterback that we think that he is, because the defensive needs, they addressed some of them in the offseason. They didn't address the pass rush, which we think is really important. And it's probably something that they'll realize is super important as the year goes on. And they may go out and get somebody, or they may try to pick up more pass rushers in the offseason, depending on injuries and stuff. But this is a very winnable schedule. And you can only win the games that are put in front of you, they say.
Yeah, that's true.
And if Frank Wright is the coach that we think he is and Bryce Young is the quarterback that we hope he is, this team could definitely compete. And I think it's a perfect division to be in for a young quarterback because there are so many question marks.
Yeah, And Bob, to your point with this schedule, it's the weakest conference, or correction, the weakest division plays the other weakest division in its conference, with the North and the South playing each other in the NFC. Then they're playing the weakest conference in the division in the AFC South. So the whole division is given the easy layups on each other, which is when we just went through the NFC North, we all were thinking they were about 500, and maybe at best the winners 9 wins over there. Detroit FanDuel has Detroit at 9.5. So that means that it's not a slam dunk that the South is going to get swept. And I do think that looking at this, that we all are being hard on the South. But realistically, I think that the ceiling for them isn't that dissimilar from the North. It's 9.5 wins. And with Frank Reich, I'm willing to bet that they are closer to being a playoff team than they are to being a top 10 pick. And I think that that's the way it's going to go. Yeah, I mean, we're grading them on the way we're grading every team. Can you make the Super Bowl? Can you make noise in this league? And the reality is, are they going to go into Philadelphia or San Francisco and win? No. Are they going to be able to get in the playoffs and maybe upset someone who thinks they're hot stuff and doesn't, like the Cowboys? Well, if they run the ball, yeah. And that's the possibility. And Frank Reich, he made the hat. Ran the damn ball. That's what he's all about. So, Bob, as I conclude this episode here, I look at this looking forward to what we're going to be doing with the fantasy shows moving forward. And I think the under-the-radar one we're going to be talking about the next couple of weeks is going to be Miles Sanders, as they do run the ball in Carolina. So we'll see with the other team players. If you're still watching this video, stick with us, click subscribe, and we'll be with you here every single night for the rest of the year.